Welcome, everyone. This session is on the Empower Inclusive Employment Initiative, and I am your host, and I will just introduce the session, and then I'll pass it on to the two presenters. So welcome to this virtual room. My name is Emil Tompa. I am the Executive Director of IDEA, Inclusive Design for Employment Access. We're a core member of the Disability and Working Canada Steering Committee. In terms of my identity, I'm a gender neutral person. I look like a male, but I'm a gender neutral from the LGBTQ plus community. I'm older, white, have gray hair. Today's session, as I mentioned, is Empower Inclusive Employment. There will be a live Q&A after the end of the presentations. Regarding how the Q&A option works, at the bottom of your screen, you should see or be able to identify a Q&A little icon, which if you click on that, you can put in your questions in the text box that pops up when you click on that icon. Or you can also do it through the chat function, which is also an icon at the bottom of your screen. So we will monitor both the Q&A and chat box for questions from the audience. That'll happen at the end of a presentation that our two presenters will be giving. So I'll re-explain how the Q&A will be working once we get to that point. So we have two panelists. Our first panelist is Elizabeth White, who is the manager of programs with Work Wellness Institute. Our second presenter is Tara Beaton, who's a facilitator with the Work Wellness Institute. More comprehensive bios of these two individuals is available on the DWC website. So if you're interested in learning more about who they are and their backgrounds, please do check out their full bios on the DWC website. I will now pass it on to my panelists to take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emil, and to the entire Disability and Work Conference team for the warm welcome and for having us here, as we're very excited for this opportunity to join in shared learning today. As mentioned, my name is Elizabeth, and I am a Caucasian female with dark blonde hair, wearing glasses and a cream and taupe blouse today. I would like to start by acknowledging that the Work Wellness Institute has the privilege to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I'm actually going to put up a quick poll just now. There is two questions, but if we could just focus on the first one, that would be wonderful, as we're just interested in where everyone is joining today from. So if you don't mind taking that moment to let us know where you're joining today, that would be wonderful. And while those answers are being collected, just a little introduction about the Work Wellness Institute. So since our inception in 1985, the Work Wellness Institute has been guided by a steadfast mission to spearhead evidence-informed change through collaborative efforts and esteemed partners across academia, industry, government, and the community. Our vision is centered on the transformation of research into practice, fostering global research initiatives and mobilizing knowledge to create positive impacts on workplace health practices, along with our core values of collaboration, integrity, inclusivity, and development. This ethos remains at the core of everything that we do. And if you're interested in just learning more about us later, I encourage you to visit our website, and I'll just end the poll here for a moment. Thank you so much for everyone for participating, and wonderful to see everyone joining us today. I will follow up with a housekeeping note that Emil so kindly already pointed out, which is both the chat and Q&A functions. We will be utilizing the chat throughout our session today to really foster that shared learning environment. So please keep watch, as we'll be sending through reflections and discussions and all of those wonderful things. So please keep watch on that, and we really encourage everyone to participate as fully as they are able to today. And we'll be sending in a few extra learning materials throughout that today as well. So the chat will be well utilized, and then as mentioned, we do have the Q&A function open as well for a dedicated time at the end. So I do really extend my gratitude to each of you for your participation today. And now really moving into the main event, and excited to introduce a longtime partner of the Work Wellness Institute, as mentioned, Tara Beaton. As a seasoned speaker, trainer, and disability management expert, Tara uses her 25 years of experience in accessibility, vocational rehabilitation, and training to help organizations achieve healthy, productive, and sustainable workplaces. Tara holds a Master of Adult Education degree, a disability management diploma, and both the Certified Disability Management Professional and Certified Vocational Rehabilitation Professional designations. So, with Tara's dedication to advocating for disability rights and promoting workplace inclusion, I'm happy to pass things to you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Again, my name is Tara Beaton. I am she, her are my pronouns. I am a 51-year-old white settler cis woman with brown hair. Today I am wearing a pink shirt, a blue sweater, and eyeglasses. I identify as twice exceptional neurodivergent. And today you might notice a few things that are my tells. For example, while doing the formal aspect of presentations, I tend to be pretty paced with my speaking, but when we get into the, let's say, unrehearsed FAQ portion of things, you might notice me getting a little bit more quick with my verbal, that's my hyperactivity coming out. And so again, bearing in mind the need to pace as possible, I will certainly do my best. You may also notice me moving around a bit in order to keep going with my presentation. There is a little bit of switching that goes along with this on the back end, which can be a challenge given my cognitive limitations, let's say. So a few things you may see that make me a little bit unique. So just to let you know that. In preparing this session, what Elizabeth and I really wanted to do was to offer some practical ideas that can be used to make workplaces more disability inclusive. We wanted to have a little bit of interaction and provide you some material and information that you can take with you. So hopefully that's the experience that you will have today.
Sorry, Tara, I just want to interrupt as it's not the full screen that we're viewing. We do see the presentation view right now.
Oh my goodness. Thank you. What is happening? I apologize. Please hold. Do, 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 do. Okay, do you see the presenter view or just the slide?
Still the same view, unfortunately.
Oh my goodness.
Hi, Tara. I can share it for you if you want. I have it pulled up here.
Thank you. Let's do what we need to keep the party going, shall we? It's always technology.
How's
Yeah,
this?
I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Just let me know when to switch slides for you.
Okay, thank you. I apologize for that, folks. Alrighty. So, just give me a moment to get myself back where I was. Appreciate it. Okay. So, yes. So as far as Emil already explained, we'll be doing, we're going to ask for questions to be held until the end. We'll have a Q&A session at the end. And we will be using the chat in this session. For me, learning really is not just about me speaking or, you know, attendees listening. I learn from you, you learn from each other. So please do feel free to use the chat at any time during this session. I'll be posing a few reflection questions, and you're more than welcome to use the chat to record your ideas and share them with one another. And then when I refer to them as in chat questions, we will actually have a look at a few things that have been entered in there and discuss them together before moving on in the presentation. Really, all that's designed to do is to make best use of our time while we're together. Okay, so we will get started. The intended outcomes of this session is for us by the end of this to be able to identify barriers to inclusive employment, to develop some disability inclusive hiring practices. We'll talk about implementing accommodations and as well related to that, improving accessibility and ways to do that, concrete ways to foster a disability inclusive culture. And then we also hope that you will gain some practical tools that will end up improving your confidence when it comes to improving workplace accessibility. The agenda at a very high level, we'll talk about the case for inclusive employment. This is something that I know, depending on where you're coming to this session with, you may have a great deal of experience with, or maybe not so much. I know that attendees of the conference come from all different perspectives, viewpoints, rules, and so on. We'll talk about identifying barriers and overcoming challenges. We're going to look specifically at a few recruitment strategies that tend to be less inclusive and how to make them more inclusive. We'll talk about creating accessible work environments and supporting employees that we already have who may be experiencing disability. Again, how all of this can help us build our confidence, and hopefully that will translate into some commitment to take some actual actions going forward and supporting our efforts. And of course, we will finish up with a discussion time and a Q&A session. I am at slide 6. What we want to start out with is just sort of setting the lay of the land. A lot of this data will be familiar to a lot of you. Some of it has been presented in prior sessions already yesterday, for example. So just a few quick numbers to talk about the prevalence of disability, as well as particularly in the workplace. And then very briefly, what we understand to be some of the benefits of having a disability inclusive workplace. Slide 7. All right, so some of the numbers that we have, as far as disability, in the first bullet point tells us, and this is from Statistics Canada, this information was published a few months ago. In 2022, 27% of Canadians reported having one or more disabilities. And as well, the number and proportion of people who experience disability in Canada is growing. For example, between 2017 and 2022, that number has increased by 5%. As far as disability and employment, the employment rate in 2023 was just over 47% for those reported having one or more disability versus almost 67% for those without. So we can see that as a significant gap in the employment rate. As well, the statistics tell us that people with disabilities on average earn less per hour, and the severity of experienced disability tends to be associated with a decrease in one's likelihood of employment. So these are significant numbers. This is the reality of Canadian society, and it's important for us to know, and certainly for organizations to be aware of. Moving to slide 8. Just a quote here from the same Statistics Canada report that I thought was worth sharing. In terms of intersectionality, disability intersects with age, sex, educational attainment, and racialized groups to influence labor market outcomes. So in the data that was collected in this particular, in the labor force survey, it's been, the outcome of the data tells us quite clearly that it holds up that experience of intersectionality. For example, there is a lower than average employment rate if one is a youth with a disability or a racialized person with a disability. So that comes into play as well, and just things for us to be aware of. The next slide, we were summarizing just a few of the benefits for organizations for being disability inclusive, or at least making some improvements toward that goal. The first is compliance. It is sometimes it's the biggest stick, sometimes it's the biggest motivator for organizations, but it is certainly one of the benefits. Next, we also have the ability to access a greater talent pool and to attract very often more people. So if we have a workplace that is not necessarily disability inclusive, that is an automatic deterrent for a significant proportion of the talent pool. And we'll talk more about that as we proceed. As well, diverse teams tend to approach issues from multiple angles. And this results in them being able to find more creative solutions. And so innovation and creativity, certainly in today's workplaces, organizations are looking to be able to capture those benefits. As well, a disability inclusive workplace fosters a culture of inclusion as well as empathy, and this leads to a more collaborative dynamic in the workplace, which again translates into contributing to strategic goals in most cases. As well, it encourages employees to adapt and grow. It strengthens both individual and organizational resilience, which in turn cultivates trust. And finally, disability inclusive workplaces helps organizations to retain talent. So in other words, hang on to those people who do have valuable skills and perspectives that they bring to their role. Turnover is a challenge for many organizations. And so having a disability inclusive workplace and taking steps to that end can help in practical terms for turnover as well. In our next section, slide 10, we are just going to look at identifying barriers and overcoming challenges when it comes to disability inclusion in the workplace. We do see a clear case for inclusive employment here. So why does it still seem to be so elusive? Why do we still see those numbers that we talked about earlier? Let's look at what gets in the way. So that is, what are the barriers to workplace inclusion? And we're going to take a bit of a spotlight on stigma and company culture. And stigma is going to come up more than once in our session today. We'll look at what some of those barriers might look like, and whether that might be, for example, during the recruitment process or later on the job when the employee is already ensconced within the organization. So slide 11, we'll start with barriers to inclusive employment. The fact that they're often systemic, this is something that research tells us, and these barriers can prevent highly capable applicants from being located, from being considered, or from being selected for positions. So we're going to look in this session at barriers in 4 general areas, talk about what they are, and then later on we'll get into a little bit more concrete examples, okay? So in the area of stigma, and that may be about stigma regarding disability in general, it may be about stigma regarding mental health, neurodiversity, etc. Many areas that touch disability experience. Stigma stems from a lack of understanding or misconceptions about what a person with a disability can do. So for example, there may be a concept that this person is less capable or from that less productive than their non-disabled peers. And this is despite evidence to the contrary. This in turn can lead to discrimination in hiring, in assignments or promotions, in other words, exclusion. It also in turn reinforces stereotypes and in turn perpetuates a cycle of exclusion. And again, we'll come back to stigma in just a moment. But moving to our next point on this slide, let's talk briefly about unconscious bias. And not just bias, but specifically unconscious bias. We know that unconscious bias exists, and this does affect decisions with respect to employment, even despite where there is good intent. There is a natural tendency for people to favor candidates who have ways that are similar to the existing group, or perhaps similar to the person who's making the decisions with respect to hiring, assigning projects, and so on. So with that in mind, we need to be applying intentional bias reduction strategies. It's not just enough to be aware. It is extremely important to build into our processes structures, strategies, and steps that will serve to counteract that natural tendency toward unconscious bias. Slide 12. Third, let's talk briefly about a barrier of lack of tools or infrastructure. This can be something very concrete, let's say, like digital tools that are not compatible with screen readers, for example. For many people, these certain tools and infrastructure are really essential. By that, I mean, without it, they may struggle to fulfill the requirements of their job. And so by providing a different approach or a different tool or flexibility to allow things to be done in a different way, that removes that barrier and frees that person up to do the great work that they are capable of doing. And often it's not necessarily a tool that's required. It might just be a change in approach. So we'll talk a little bit more about flexibility as well as we go ahead. Fourth, let's talk a little bit about inflexible processes, particularly in recruitment, but not necessarily limited to recruitment. This is where we can talk about standardized or one-size-fits-all procedures. And I've got in the first bullet point there, all in quotation marks, because, you know, when we acknowledge the fact that people are diverse, then we know that one size will never fit all. And so if we are trying to standardize to the point, standardization makes sense for a lot of reasons in the areas of assessment, evaluation, measurement, and so on. But when it comes to human diversity, we need to be very careful how far we take that. And so, again, assessments may not be accessible to a person. That's our next point here. Or importantly, they may not be really reflective of the person's capability. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments as well. And my last point here is about rigid job descriptions. So for example, it's very common even now to continue to include non-essential requirements in job postings and even job descriptions. So that includes tasks that could easily be modified or perhaps redistributed among other employees. And that can include things like not allowing for alternative qualifications as well. We could take that to include things like education and training and experience. Well, again, job descriptions and postings we'll get into in a little bit more detail. While we're on this subject, however, I did want to let folks know I came across a wonderful article by Ludmila Preslova. For those of you who follow her, she's just a great thought leader in the area of neurodiversity. She did an article in Forbes 1 week ago today, and she looks at this area in the lens of neurodiversity in particular. So if that's an area that interests you, I suggest you look it up. That's in Forbes from November 21st. Slide 13, moving right along. There are many opportunities for employers to address barriers to inclusive employment. For our purposes, the 4 types of barriers that we just discussed can be mitigated in several ways. First, we hear about this a lot, but educating about disability awareness, providing training for everybody that includes disability awareness, combating stigma, and so on. Second, by implementing practices during the hiring process that reduce the chance of unconscious bias. Third, by making the workplace accessible, including in the approaches that we take. And fourth, by reevaluating key processes, such as during recruitment, to make them more flexible. So again, as you can see, we're talking about sort of the way things are, the barriers that exist, what we need to do to address them, and then we're going to get more specific into the how. In our next slide, we're going to take a closer look at stigma, as I mentioned, and then we'll consider the importance as well of company culture. So slide 14, we discussed that stigma around disability can cause us to make assumptions about what someone is capable of doing, including at work. For example, that a person may be less productive, that they may need excessive and therefore possibly costly accommodation, that they may have a high rate of absenteeism, and that may be costly or result in being reliable in terms of having labor available when it's needed. And the results that we have here, the results of this kind of stigma include things like hesitancy to hire. The person may be sidelined from opportunities when they have joined the organization. And the employee may feel underestimated or undervalued. This can decrease morale and therefore engagement, productivity, innovation, retention, all the things that we've mentioned as well. So again, stigma, the results can be very significant for the organization, not even to speak of what the impact that it has on employees and certainly individuals. In our next slide, we talk a bit about company culture. So in other words, these are the norms, values, and behaviors that define how people work together in a given environment. And a culture that is not inclusive might, for example, value physical presence over results, might fail to openly prioritize exclusion, and other things. And as a result of this, employees may hesitate to disclose a disability. They may hesitate to request accommodation when it's something that they require and therefore that the employer needs to provide. It limits both individuals themselves as well as the organization in terms of its ability to adapt and to grow. So now that we've taken a closer look at the importance of addressing stigma in company culture, now let's look at some examples of what these barriers to workplace inclusion might look like, both during the recruitment process as well as on the job. All right, 16. First, during recruitment, during that process, we might see, for example, a screening out of a candidate based on a gap in their employment. Okay, I love this example. Gaps in employment to recruiters tend to trigger assumptions about subpar work performance. Okay, and this is, you know, why was there no, what is all this job hopping? Why is there this big gap between this person working in this role and this role? There are many reasons for which someone may have a gap in their work experience that have nothing to do with what kind of a performer they were in a workplace. And certainly for people with disabilities, that can definitely be the case if they are engaged, if they have a change in functioning, if they are engaging in intensive medical treatment, for example. So just something to be aware of. Secondly, prioritizing non-essentials in a posting or when assessing candidates. We referred to this earlier. This can disproportionately deter or disqualify people with disabilities who are capable of doing the work of the job. So for example, you know, we could say a job where the person is, it's really an IT job that's very much about the software and the digital end of things, but includes something like a heavy lifting restriction or a medium lifting restriction. What we need to do is consider what the duties and tasks are to accomplish the purpose of the job and what could be modified, done in a different way, perhaps redistributed, managed with a certain kind of technology or a different approach, and so on. And finally, a one size fits all, again, that expression we know is faulty in and of itself and because of human diversity, but particularly in the interview process. Often so-called traditional interview processes are processes that were developed without applying a disability lens. And so interviews in particular, we look at some examples of that in our session. The next slide. So let's look at a scenario together. What I'll do is you'll see some bullet points here, and Elizabeth, I believe, is going to put the long version of the explanation in the chat so that you can see the full description if that helps you. So I'm going to go ahead and read through a scenario, and then I'm going to ask us to share some ideas in the chat. Okay? You are administering a work sample to a room full of job candidates, each one seated at a computer. The candidates have 2 hours to work through a case study, during which they have access to various online research tools, as well as software with which to submit their work. Candidates with a question may raise their hand at any time, at which time you will approach them and discuss their question. To guard against any kind of cheating or unfair advantage, candidates may not leave the room during this assessment. Over the course of the assessment, your team members enter the room periodically to quietly ask you questions about a project that they are working on. At the end of the 2 hours, one candidate leaves the room, informing you on their way out that they will be abandoning the competition. When you ask why, they respond that they were unable to complete the assessment. You wish them well in their ongoing job search. Now, aspects in this scenario may have unwittingly created barriers for candidates with certain disabilities. In the chat, what needs might this candidate have that were not considered? Please feel free to share any ideas that you have. Great to see your ideas coming in.
Yes, we have someone thinking of dyslexia or IBS. I'll also time note it is 1:46.
Thank you.
The inability to sit for a prolonged time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. So, I
Wonderful.
mean, thank you so much, Elizabeth. There are so many things. Having online access to things can be distracting for people who have cognitive concerns as well. Having interruptions, perhaps the seating isn't appropriate, not being able to leave a room. Is that really necessary? Some people may have legitimate reasons to need to leave the room, and so on. So many different possibilities can come into play here as well. Okay, I'm going to move a little bit quickly. We have a lot of information, so you might notice me going a little bit quickly here. So, oh my goodness, sorry, lost the spot. All right. Slide 18, in our day-to-day work on the job, barriers may come in the form of accommodation, such as people lack awareness that accommodation is available, or the process may be overcomplicated. It may come in the form of a perception, again, that a person with disabilities may be absent or not be reliable, and then certainly exclusion from opportunities as well. On slide 20, I am going to just read through the scenario here. So for example, let's imagine that there is a project coming up. You are the leader of the project. It involves travel. Two people are willing to go, both Peter and Mo. Peter uses a power chair. Mo does not. Peter has shared in the past that he's had difficulty with, that he's had damage to his power chair. And they both are equal in terms of their performance capability, and you end up offering the opportunity to Mo. What's worth asking is, what assumptions might you have made, or what information might you be missing or left unconsidered when making decisions like this? In other words, offering opportunities to people, some of whom may have experiencing disabilities and others who do not. I need to go ahead to slide 21. Job requirements can exclude candidates or dissuade them from applying because they misunderstand actual role demands, or they may feel preemptively excluded. And we referred to that earlier when we talked about making very clear that what we put in a job posting or a requirement is actually required and does not have any flexibility offered in it. 22, job postings, again, same idea. We want to be focused on what's truly required. We also want to signal the organization's commitment to diversity and accessibility, perhaps through a statement, but importantly through the entire process itself. Certainly, if there is flexibility and options made available in the job, be sure to mention that. That's information that may be very valuable to candidates who are looking at that posting. And if possible, offer multiple ways to apply. Sometimes people need different approaches in order to be effective in the application process itself. Let me see, 23. I'm going to skip 23. Apologize for that. Just keeping an eye on my time. 24. Postings can pose barriers themselves in terms of things like accessibility of a website, as well as, for example, being able to navigate. If someone cannot view the details on the website, if it's difficult because of the design or the technology, the compatibility in the background, those can pose barriers. They may not be able to find the information. They may not be able to successfully go through your application process. It may require a lot of very precise clicking of a mouse, or there's many different ways. And so being thoughtful about these things in advance can go a long way to prevent those types of barriers of getting in the way of accessing some great candidates. 25, we've mentioned uncertainty about accommodation. I'll go ahead to 26. Strategies related to recruitment processes and procedures also include the fact that the procedures tend to be inflexible. We alluded to that a little bit earlier by taking that so-called one-size-fits-all approach in the name of consistency, efficiency, reliability. we need to be careful about doing that. So for example, by doing all pre-interview screens via telephone, that may be convenient for the organization, but it may have the unintended effect of blocking out and discounting a number of possibly excellent candidates for employment. This may look like a long, complex online application process that requires a lot of extensive typing and box selection. There's a lot of things to be thinking about. We just want to be thinking ahead in the way that we're designing things so that we are not throwing up those barriers from the get-go. Let's do another quick chat item about communication and recruiter outreach. So despite the fact that people's individual communication needs will vary, it's very common for organizations to use a common approach and approach candidates in all of the same way without really offering flexibility. So we're making a lot of assumptions there. We do want to flex to candidate needs and offer alternatives. We don't want to use things like jargon. We want to, we don't want to use jargon. We want to use plain language. So for example, the scenario we have here is when modifying how information is communicated, that can be an accommodation. So what I'd like you to do is, and this doesn't necessarily have to be a recruiter. This doesn't necessarily have to be, an application process. This could even be just the way that the job gets done in the workplace. Can you think of an example of something that might be an alternative communication method that could be offered to an employee or a candidate, and it would be a form of accommodation in that particular circumstance? Providing interview, yes, thank you very much. Providing interview questions in advance. So advanced communication, providing them in writing. Absolutely. Okay. I'm going to share with you one example that I have come across very often, and that is following up meetings, staff meetings, one-on-one meetings with a written summary. Some people, the auditory piece of it, like everything sounds great when that's going on, but then when everybody steps away, a lot of that information can sort of be lost or misconstrued. Demonstration that they can perform the skills required instead of talking about them. Sure, yeah, instead of being like, tell me how you would, show me if the possibility is there to do that. So there's many different ideas, and I know that we're trying to be as practical as possible in a very condensed amount of time here, but so those are some great examples as well. All right, I am going to move ahead. We have can I get a time check?
It's 10:54.
Perfect.
And thank you to everyone for continuing to share your ideas. This is exactly what we're wanting to create.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm sorry that I'm moving ahead quickly, but yes, please keep the conversation going. All right, I'm going to go ahead with slide 29, candidate assessment. So selecting a great candidate for a job requires making an effective assessment. And we're going to talk about what makes a good assessment. And a lot of this has to do with just good assessment in general, but certainly bearing in mind when you are assessing something, how you may be not necessarily measuring what you think you are. So an accurate, good candidate assessment is fair, accurate, and useful. Fair is equitable. Useful means it yields information that can be used to say, can this person actually do this job? And so if we are using assessment methods that are measuring things in a certain way that don't allow that person to demonstrate their capabilities, maybe we need to change our assessment approach. It needs to be able to predict job performance. It certainly needs to be legally compliant. The preference is that the assessment would be carried out by people who are trained to do them, and so that they have this knowledge about evaluation and the limits of sort of the validity and reliability of the assessments that they are using. We want them to measure the right things. We want them to evoke evidence of skills that are relevant. Ideally, we would like to use multiple tools so that we get a more holistic picture of the candidate and what their capabilities are. We certainly want them to use clear and objective criteria. Assessments really should be flexible enough to work for different people. We want them to be bias-free. And the last point on slide 29 is we want assessments to leave candidates feeling that they have been respected and treated fairly. You know, there's that, the expression escapes me, something to do, it was an Einstein expression about teaching a fish to climb a tree. It's, I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about. If you ask someone questions that don't allow them in their way to express who they are and what they can do, that feels really unfair, and it reinforces that they were not thought of. And so if they're not being thought of in the recruitment process, what's the likelihood they'll be thought of on the job if they were to be successful and accept a role? We are getting close to our Q&A session. I do want to touch on slide 31 here, and this will be our last quick chat with respect to interviews in particular. So the way that interviews tend to be structured can disadvantage some people. That can be anything from the way the environment is set up to making assumptions based on a candidate's appearance or the impression that they make. So, but what I mean by that, so for example, let's say that in an interview process, there's a group assignment that's been assigned, and one of the candidates appears to be quite reserved. There's a tendency for us to make assumptions about what that means in terms of their ability to work with others on their team, when that may have something to do with disability. So we really need to question those assumptions and think about what we are applying when we're using these assessments and drawing conclusions from them. The scenario I'm going to offer to you right now is, and I'll read it to you. Your HR department, so you're a manager, your HR department tells you that they've booked video interviews for 3 of your 4 shortlisted candidates. The 4th candidate asked to conduct the interview with their camera off, but was advised that it's policy for all video interviews to be conducted with cameras on. What might be the result of being inflexible about the interview format used? I think we know the answer to that. I think what I would like us to speak to is what accessibility related reasons might a candidate have for engaging in an interview with their camera off? Go ahead. And Elizabeth, if you can call them out when you hear them. Why do some people want their camera off? Mm-hmm.
That both the scenario and the question is in the chat for those that it might be helpful there. Processing related accessibility, just more a personality of being shy. The visuals are too distracting. Maybe there is tics related to Tourette's and not wanting to be judged for that. Maintaining their privacy, having the camera on adds to nerves or anxiety.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'll call out 3 of those that jumped out at me. Number 1, the distraction. Sometimes it's much easier for people to not be, they can focus on the auditory and not have the visual distracting. Perhaps processing takes a little bit more time, and that can be again related to the distracting, and it can be very helpful and an accommodation for someone to not have to worry about how they are presenting on camera. And then if someone has a visible disability that they're not in a position right now that they want to disclose yet, they want to get to know a little bit more about this job opportunity. And so, you know, we need to respect that. And we don't want a visible disability to factor into decision-making in the recruitment process anyway. So many different reasons why for which somebody might have disability related, for which someone might want to have their camera off. And really, you know, if we are asking ourselves, the policy is cameras must be on, we need to ask ourselves why. Why is that? Is there really a legitimate reason for that? And what might be the discriminatory impact of having a policy like that?
And just a time check, we have a few minutes before we would need to move into Q&A.
Perfect. Okay. So everyone does have I will call your attention. You do have access to the full deck here. We really put in a lot of, we were aware that we were going to put a chock full of information here. We also have a couple of handouts that we are providing to you that you can take away information. So I'll just call your attention to that as well. But in the interest of time, we certainly want to keep moving so that we've got time for discussion as we go. So the last thing that we're going to talk about again is having a supportive environment, and then I'll speak briefly just now and refer you back to our handout here. Creating a supportive environment in general, here are some practical tips that organizations and employers can take with them. Make training available for everybody. There's also, it's a great idea for new hires to have a buddy system so that you can assign someone that can answer questions, and it helps to create a support network for new employees, whether they are a person with a disability or they are joining an organization where they will be working with people with disabilities, or we don't want to make assumptions on either end, so that can be helpful as well. Make sure that we have an effective and well-communicated accommodation process, that materials are accessible, including digital materials, have knowledge and access to assistive technologies that may help people who have those needs. For goodness sake, if we can continue to offer flexible work arrangements, do that and let people know that those exist. Another just scenario here that we can think about is, an accommodation might look like something as simple as letting an employee have access to a quiet workspace. That can be something that is a nice to have for perhaps a typical employee, but for an employee that experiences disability, this may be a requirement in order to level that playing field, as we like to say. I'm going to move to slide 38. And before I do, sorry, I want to briefly emphasize the importance of two things: making leadership opportunities available to people with disabilities, such as by making mentorship and development opportunities accessible, as well as the importance of attending to team dynamics when to support employees. So for example, there's some best practices that can be followed when onboarding new employees. You'll find more details on those topics in both in the PowerPoint deck that's been made available to you, as well as one of the two handy PDF handouts that we have made available as well. But before we wrap up, just briefly, slide 38. Sometimes things don't go as planned. So not every situation is going to go smoothly. All employees can encounter setbacks at some times. If issues arise, we recommend address them as early as possible. If an employee is struggling with their performance, do take steps to make sure that this is not due to inadequate accommodation. Engage them in the solution, and be willing to go back and review your expectations of them and of the job. Look at those core responsibilities and see if any aspects can be adjusted. And of course, if you have supports and resources available, bring those in to be supportive. All right, I'm moving ahead to slide 45. I do hope the session has enlarged your toolkit and fortified your confidence to identify barriers to inclusive employment, apply disability inclusive hiring practices, provide appropriate accommodations, promote accessibility, and foster a disability inclusive culture. Again, please have a look at those handouts for more information. And I hope that you'll take a moment to reflect on one thing that you can do, what you could commit to improve disability inclusion, perhaps in your own organization. And I'll hand it back over to Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. We're just going to launch one last poll, and I have put in that last chat that Tara has provided in terms of the commitment that you may be making yourselves to improve disability inclusion in your organization. So feel free, that can be absolutely individual reflection, or please feel free to continue that shared learning. So I'm just going to launch the poll again. You will notice that the first question is there. So please feel free to ignore, or if you want to restate where you're joining from, more than happy to receive that. But more importantly, if you could look to the second question, just hoping to have provided some learning with you. And it's a scale of 1 through 5, 1 kind of being the disagree and 1 and 5 being strongly agree section. So if you don't mind taking a few moments for that. And before we have Emil come join us for the Q&A, I would just like to extend my thanks to Tara, the Disability in Work Conference, and of course to yourselves for being here with us and engaging in such important topics and discussion. And I'll reiterate, as Tara has, that the PowerPoint is available through the conference portal, and I have put in 3 different handouts that have some extra goodies, takeaways, summaries, extra tips and tricks. So hopefully you will find those helpful, and I do encourage you to download those ahead of closing the session today. And yes, just again, thank you for your participation, and just close with the remarks of let us continue to embark on this journey of learning, collaboration, and growth as we collectively work together towards a future where workplace wellness, inclusion, and knowledge converge harmoniously.